How's that? Okay, good. That always helps. Okay. Well, it's good to be with you again, and I'm looking forward to the three messages I'll be giving today. This little slide here just lets you know I do take questions on Facebook and Twitter, so take advantage of that. And if you scan this QR code, you'll get 2 free ebooks. Genesis 1, A Scientific Perspective, Darwinian Evolution, basically looking at a critique of the new Darwinian models that are out there. So take advantage of that. But my first message today will be on Beyond the Cosmos, where I really look at God's transdimensionality, how we in physics and astronomy can now demonstrate that there is a being beyond space and time, and that our universe is more than just length, width, height, and time, and how recent cosmic discoveries reveal God's glory and his power. Now, I'm an astrophysicist. I also serve on the faculty of 3 different seminaries, and I'm a pastor at a church that's between Caltech Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the headquarters of the Skeptic Society. For 50 years, I've been leading a class for skeptics, and what's fun is because we're so close to the Skeptic Society, we have a regular number of atheists that participate, trying to sharpen their claws, but it's fun to watch them come to faith in Jesus Christ. God's transdimensionality. Now, as I mentioned yesterday in our conference that we had, is that today we have space-time theorems. And these theorems are based on just 2 assumptions: that the universe has mass, and all of you are living proof that indeed the universe does contain mass, and that general relativity reliably describes the movements of bodies in the universe. If those 2 things are true, and we know they are true, then that means that there is actually a beginning to space and time, that space and time are created, and therefore there must be an agent beyond space-time that created our universe of matter, energy, space, and time. And as I explained yesterday, that's unique to the Bible. What you see in the other religious holy books is God or gods creating within space and time that eternally exists. The Bible stands alone in saying, no, space and time are not eternal. They have a beginning. They are created. And this is what Alexander Vilenkin said about these space-time theorems. He said, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And the problem is a God beyond space and time created the universe. And even Lawrence Krauss, our nation's most famous atheist physicist, said this in his book, A Universe from Nothing. One cannot rule out such a deistic view of nature. It's on the scientific table. But you know, the Bible said it first, right in the very first sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that phrase, the heavens and the earth, refers to the entirety of physical reality. And what we see in the New Testament, Hebrews 11:3, the universe was formed at God's command, so what was seen was not made from what was visible, declaring that the universe that we can detect did not come from that which we can detect. And the Bible also stands alone in saying that there's a beginning to space and time, and that God was actually doing things before space and time existed. Again, unique to Christianity, unique to the Bible, is this concept that we have a God that begins his works of redemption before he creates anything at all. We were celebrating God's redemption in communion that actually got launched before space and time, before the universe even existed. As it says in 2 Timothy 1:9, this grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. Now, in my career, I've debated many atheist scientists all over the world. You can watch some of the debates on YouTube. The most common rebuttal I get from atheist scientists is, okay, you're saying that God created the universe. Who created God? By the way, both of my sons asked me that question when they were about 3.5 years of age. So it's not just PhD physicists that had come up with that challenge. If God created the universe, who created God? And it's actually a category error. What they're ignoring is that the entire universe is subject to a single dimension of time. Everything in the universe is subject to a single dimension of time. But God is not so constrained. He created time. He's not subject to time. And here's the irony. Any entity constrained to a single line of time where time can't be stopped or reversed must have a beginning, must have a creation moment along that line of time. And so when the atheist raises his charge, they're actually, ironically, proving that creation is a reality. Now, this God that created time is not subject to time, and the space-time theorems basically prove that God can create any number of time dimensions he chooses, any number of space dimensions he chooses. So what I shared with my sons when they asked me at age 3.5, who created God? I said, well, God's not constrained to a single line of time. He has access to a plane of time. And so what I did is I came up with this little demo here. Okay, here's our line of time going forward, and then God can dwell on another line of time. Matter of fact, he could do this. That could be our timeline. This could be his timeline. He could be operating on an infinite number of timelines that never cross or touch our timeline. As such, he would have no beginning, he would have no ending, he would not be created. Notice the Bible is the only holy book that states that about God. No beginning, no ending, not created. That only makes mathematical sense if God is not constrained to a single dimension of time. And now we got space-time theorems that prove that very point. Now, when our sons first learned how to talk, we had them pray every night. But again, I can remember when they were about 3 or 4, they basically challenged me and said, how can God listen to all of our prayers? They said, you have us pray. There could be 1 billion other kids praying at the same time. How can God pay individual attention to all those prayers? Well, I took them back to this particular diagram and said, here's our line of time, but God can operate on a plane of time, on a sphere of time if he wanted to. He could operate on a timeline perpendicular to ours that's infinitely long. So what would be 3 seconds for us would be infinite time for God. Therefore, it's no problem for him to pay individual one-on-one attention to 10 billion prayers that are given up to him all at the same time. He can do that. Now, the wonderful thing is when I explained that to my sons at that early age, that gave them the confidence from that point forward, God hears my prayers. He hears all of our prayers. The phone lines never get jammed. Okay. How many of you ever heard of the Large Hadron Collider? Okay, it's the most expensive science experiment ever conducted by humanity. It's this giant particle accelerator that's so big, it spans 2 different countries. Part of it is in Switzerland, part of it is in France. And this is what the inside of the Large Hadron Collider looks like. But it was particle physics, theoretical physics and particle physics, experimental particle physics, that demonstrated something to us we didn't know until just 20 years ago. Namely, that there's not enough room within the dimensions of length, width, height, and time for all the symmetries that are required by quantum mechanics and gravity. Now, for life to be possible in the universe, we need both quantum mechanics and gravity. And so this was noted at Caltech 20 years ago. And they said, we have to conceive of the universe as having more than length, width, height, and time in order to have both quantum mechanics and gravity coexisting so life could be possible. And when I was at Caltech, there was this team of theoretical physicists that said, okay, we know that in order to have room for all the symmetries, we need a minimum of 8 dimensions of space, but no more than 26 dimensions of space. And it took them an entire decade to figure out what is the right answer. Today we know the answer is 9 dimensions of space. Now, here's how it all works out. And this is how our cosmic creation model integrates with our particle creation model. The universe begins with 9 dimensions of space. They all rapidly expand from the cosmic creation event. But when the universe is very tiny, it's extremely hot. It's so hot that all the forces of physics are unified. But as the universe expands, it reaches a point where gravity can separate out from the other three forces of physics. When that happens, 6 of the 9 dimensions stop expanding. They're still here today. Those extra 6 dimensions, however, are no bigger than what they were when gravity separated out from the other 3 forces of physics. You say, well, how big are they? Well, they're about 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the diameter of a proton, which probably explains why most of you haven't noticed them for a while. I mean, they're really that tiny. Or a way to visualize them, it's like these extra 6 dimensions are wrapped up as very tiny scrolls around the 3 big dimensions. But the cross-section of the scroll is literally 1/10,000,000th of a trillionth of a diameter of a proton. But it's crucial in order to have a universe in which we have both quantum mechanics and gravity coexisting, so we could all enjoy being together here this morning. But what does this tell us about God? It tells us that God must exist and operate both within and beyond the 1 time dimension and the 9 space dimensions that make up the universe. At a minimum, physics has proven to us that God has a capability of moving and operating in 10 space-time dimensions. Now, of course, it could be more than that. The space-time theorems actually establish he has the power to create space-time dimensions at will. But what's unique to Christianity compared to all the other world's religions, it tells us that God is simultaneously and continuously both immanent and transcendent. Now, those are theological terms. What transcendent means is that God is completely free to operate independent of anything he has created. So there's nothing about the 10 space-time dimensions that limits what he can do. Beyond those 10 space-time dimensions, he can do whatever he wants. But immanence means that God is fully within the 10 space-time dimensions he creates. He's everywhere within his creation and can operate everywhere within his creation, but he's also beyond. He's both beyond and in. Now, if you go into, say, Islam teaches that God is transcendent, but not immanent. It's a distant God. Or if you go into Hinduism and Buddhism, God is immanent, but not transcendent. He is confined by his creation. Christianity alone says God is everywhere within his creation, but he's also transcendent beyond his creation. And you get some passages, for example, in Jeremiah 23. Can anyone hide in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do not I fill heaven and earth? Or what David says in Psalm 139, if I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. Meaning that no matter where we go within the entirety of the universe, God is there. Or to put it another way, no matter how close 2 of you may be sitting together today, God is sitting even closer to you than the person that is next to you. He is everywhere within the universe, no matter where we go. But it also tells us in the Bible that he is completely beyond. The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. We see in 1 Kings 8. Or we see in Job 37. The Almighty is beyond our reach. Or would you see Paul saying in 1 Timothy, God whom no man has seen nor can see. Now, in the class I have for skeptics, there was this one atheist who said, I want to believe, but I can't believe unless I can see God. If God is really real, why can't I see him right in front of me? And I explained to him, if you could actually see God right in front of you all the time, he would not be God. He would not have the capability of transcendence. So for God to be God, he must be invisible, he must be untouchable. And eventually he did come around and give his life to Christ. And as it says multiple places in the Psalms, the Lord is near. Or as it says in the book of Acts, he is not far from each one of us. So how do we resolve this conundrum? He is totally beyond us. We can't see or touch him. And yet it tells us that he is so close to each one of us. He's closer to each one of us as we are to one another. How do we visualize this? Well, I brought with me a couple to help you comprehend this. I mean, when I was a sophomore mathematics student, I took a course in extra-dimensional mathematics. Fascinating course, because the professor began by saying, a basketball. In 4 space dimensions, you can turn the basketball inside out without making a cut or a hole in the surface of the basketball. And he says, let me show it to you. So he basically showed us a film clip where we got to see the phenomena 2 dimensions at a time. But he says, not one of you can visualize in 4 dimensions. I can't visualize in 4 dimensions. But then he had the audacity to give us a problem assignment to prove it mathematically. That took us about a week to be able to do that. So, but his point was this: you cannot visualize phenomena in dimensions you can't personally experience. So there's a reason why we can't visualize the totality of God's being, because he's beyond the dimensions that we can experience. However, we can visualize dimensions less than what we can experience. And to help you see that, I brought with me today a couple. This couple has the handicap that they only have access to 2 dimensions, length and width. So I want to introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. Flat, okay? Unlike you, they've only got 2 dimensions. And I'm going to put them in a flat universe here. And what you're going to see is a difference between a 3-dimensional being and a 2-dimensional being. You know, it tells us in the Bible that we can't see God, we can't touch him, yet he's closer to us than we are to one another. I can put my hand above Mr. and Mrs. Flat. I can put it just 1 millimeter above them. I'm now closer to them physically than they are to one another. But because I'm above their plane, they can't see me, they can't touch me. Okay, another passage in Samuel. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Okay, here's Mr. Flat. He's engaging his wife, and as he looks at his wife, what does he see? He sees a line. Now, if he walks around his wife, he'll see a short line, longer lines, and if he continues walking around his wife, he can use his 2-dimensional brain to figure out the outline of his wife, Mrs. Flat. But notice, he can never see what's inside. But as a 3-dimensional being, I can look down on Mrs. Flat. I immediately see the total outline. I don't have to go through any kind of calculations or measurements. I get it right away. Also, I not only see the outline, I see everything inside. Likewise, God sees things in us that we can't see in one another. He sees our outer being. He sees everything inside. He sees a spirit within us that we're not able to detect within our senses. And so, yes, he knows us better than we know ourselves. That's the heart of the gospel. We make Jesus the master of our life because he knows us better than we know ourselves. And therefore, we can trust him to guide and direct us. Now, notice Christianity is the only religion that describes God as a triune being. And you can read an article I got up on our website about how science only makes sense if God is a Trinity. If God is not a Trinity, if it's just one God, then how do you explain the origin of love? Because God is 3 beings, 3 persons, they have love relationships with one another before they create anything at all. So it's no big deal for them to create beings that can also experience and express love. But a challenge to both Islam and Judaism, they've got no answer for the origin of love. And likewise, in the Eastern religions, they have many gods, but they all participate in creation in different ways. So when I was in India, for example, people were telling me, well, from a Hindu perspective, science should be filled with all kinds of incongruities, inconsistencies, and contradictions because it's the creation product of multiple gods, millions of gods. But that's not what we see in the scientific record. It really does have the character of being a single plan with a single set of purposes from a single mind. One essence and three persons. Well, one way to visualize that is I could go into this flatland universe, and with Mrs. Flat, I poke a single finger through the plane. She comes and investigates and concludes that I'm a small circle. But the next day, I could go to Mr. Flat, only this time I put 3 fingers through the plane. He investigates and concludes I'm 3 small circles. Now, from your perspective, you realize I'm a lot more than just 1 circle or 3 circles. What Mr. and Mrs. Flat were not able to visualize is that this 1 finger and these 3 fingers are all part of a closed 3-dimensional surface. From their 2-dimensional perspective, they could see the 1 or they could see the 3. And you can imagine, she goes off to the church of the 1 circle, he goes to the church of the 3 circles, and they can't reconcile how all that works. And so from a trans-dimensional perspective, we can appreciate not just this doctrine that we see in the Bible, and what I've often shared in my book, Beyond the Cosmos, you cannot comprehend the Trinity from length, width, height, and time. It requires allowing God to be as big as what the new physics proves that he must be in order to realize, hey, he's way bigger than what we can visualize. There's a reason why you don't see the Trinity in the other religions. Those religions are inventions of human beings. So of course, it limits the descriptions of what they think God is all about to what we human beings can visualize. The Bible alone describes God in a way that's impossible for us human beings to visualize. But we can mathematically prove it's correct if we allow God to be as big as it is, as he is. Now, probably the most divisive doctrine that we see in the Bible, it divides Christians against non-Christians and Christians against Christians, is this doctrine that God has granted us human beings free will and holds us accountable for all of our words, our actions, and even all of our thoughts. We'll be judged for everything. At the same time, it tells us that God is a being who is predetermined. Before he created the universe, every action you would perform, every word you would speak, and every thought that you would think. How do you reconcile divine predetermination with human free will? It can't be done in length, width, height, and time. But people have tried, and I teach on seminary campuses. It goes on to this very day. But here's a conundrum. If you go through the Bible and look at all the passages that teach human free will, there's about 1,500 Bible passages. If you look at all the places in the Bible that talk about God being sovereign and in control and predetermining everything, you get about 1,500 passages. And 8 of those passages teach both human free will and divine predetermination in the same sentence. So from a biblical perspective, both are true. From a human perspective, it looks like a contradiction. Now, what I've done in my book, Beyond the Cosmos, is say, hey, if you simply allow God the freedom to operate in 3 independent dimensions of time, there are multiple ways you can have both human free will and divine predetermination operating without any contradiction, and they can operate continuously and simultaneously. That's chapter 13. By the way, that's the chapter we're giving away for free at reasons.org/Ross, so you can see the examples I give there. And incidentally, all 3 of my suggested solutions might be wrong. That's not my point. My point is, if we allow God to be as big as what physics now proves he must be, there are millions of ways that God can resolve the paradox of human free will and divine predetermination. I'll give you a little bit of a start. The rest of it's in the book. Okay, I want you to visualize a 3-dimensional sphere. So we're talking 3 dimensions of time. So we've all think about a sphere of space. I want you to think of a sphere of time. And so this little red curve here will represent the timeline of our universe. from the beginning of the universe to the present moment. We could put God at the North Pole of this sphere of time, and he can drop a perpendicular timeline to say when he formed our Milky Way galaxy. And the second line basically shows you our present moment, and the third timeline shows you that moment when our galaxy will merge with the Andromeda galaxy. The interesting thing here is that you've got billions of years of time along our timeline that all meet together at a single instant of time at the North Pole of that sphere of time. Basically, what this demonstrates is what you see taught in the book of Ephesians, that God foreknows. He has knowledge about everything along our timeline, the timeline of your life, the timeline of the entire universe, including the future. In other words, you could have billions of timeful events throughout your life, and they all meet together at a single instant of time. So from a single instant of time, God can simultaneously know what's happening on the entirety of the timeline of our universe. But it tells us in Ephesians that God foreknows and predetermines. And so I don't have time, but you can get the book Beyond the Cosmos, that free chapter at reasons.org/Ross, and you'll see 3 different ways. You can have both operating simultaneously and continuously without contradiction. But isn't it interesting that even here in the United States, you've got churches that are focusing on free will, and you've got churches that are focusing on predetermination. You've got Arminians that teach free will. You've got Calvinists that teach predestination. People ask me, where do I stand on Arminianism and Calvinism? I say, well, I'm a Cal-Arminian. It's both, simultaneously operating. And as a physicist, I'm okay with looking at God in these extra dimensions. This is the book, Beyond the Cosmos, the free chapter, reasons.org/Ross. And we actually have a video DVD that basically is designed to teach these concepts to children. You say, why did you do that? Children get it a lot easier than adults do. Something I've tried on 4 and 5-year-olds. I actually have a theory for why it's so much easier for children. It's an experiment I did on my sons just after they were born. And my wife says I'm a compulsive experimenter. I guess that's what scientists do. But I had this idea that when they're in the womb, they're thinking 2-dimensionally. When they come out of the womb, they get introduced to 3 dimensions. And what I noticed when my sons were 2 or 3 months old, they couldn't tell the difference between a 3-dimensional toy and a 2-dimensional cutout of that toy. But by the time they were 5 or 6 months old, I couldn't fool them anymore. They knew the difference. But hey, when they're 4 years old, they're only 4 years away from that transition. You in the audience who are 40 years old or 50 years old, you've been in a 40 or 50-year rut. And so it's more challenging for you to figure this out than it is for young children. If you don't believe me, get the DVD and see it for yourself. But this was actually part of my conversion story. When I was going through the Bible in my late teens, the Gideon Bible was given to me in a public school. What I noticed is when I compared the Bible with the Quran, with the Hindu Vedas, with the Buddhist commentaries, with Zoroastrian writing, with Baha'i, what I noticed was the Bible stood alone in describing God and his attributes in ways that could not be visualized in length, width, height, and time, but could be understood if we allowed God to move and operate in extra or trans dimensions, which was proof for me that the Bible was a message that came from a being that transcended length, width, height, and time. These other holy books had the signature of coming from beings that were constrained to length, width, height, and time. So again, you can get the free ebooks by scanning that QR code. But I want to close with what I think is the most significant of these extra-dimensional doctrines we see in the Bible. And it's what happened to Jesus when he was dying on the cross. And we see in the gospel accounts, he spent between 6 to 9 hours on the cross. And the challenge I get from skeptics, how could a man in just 6 to 9 hours on the cross suffer sufficiently to atone for all the offenses that human beings have committed against one another and against God? After all, over 100 billion human beings have lived since God created Adam and Eve. How is that possible? Well, the one who is dying on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, was a man, but he was also God. And as God, he had access to dimensions beyond length, width, height, and time. Now, I'm not saying this is how God atoned for the sins of all human beings, but it's one way he could have atoned for the sins of every human being who has ever lived. And so what I want you to visualize here on the screen is a line of time coming from behind the screen, through the screen, and out. So think of it as going vertically this way. And we have Jesus spending 6 to 9 hours dying on the cross and suffering the agony of crucifixion. But because he is God, he's got access to another dimension of time, a time dimension that goes up and down on that screen. And he also has access to a third dimension of time, and in that third dimension of time, he could be suffering for eternity on 100 billion parallel lines of time. So it basically demonstrates how indeed in just 6 to 9 hours, 100 billion infinitely long lines of time of suffering could be compressed into just 6 to 9 hours of our time dimension. So this is one way Jesus, in just 6 to 9 hours, can pay for an eternity of torment for over 100 billion people who have ever lived. And it tells us in Hebrews 2:3, how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? And something I've noticed as I've shared my Christian faith with skeptics is they don't really know the measure to which Christ suffered on their behalf on the cross. So this is one way of basically helping realize the magnitude of what Jesus went through as he suffered on the cross to pay for the sins of every human being who ever lived. And the message of Hebrews is that if you actually look at the extent of what he did for us in basically offering to trade his moral perfection for our moral imperfection, how can anyone in their right mind, how can anyone rationally reject such an incredibly great offer of redemption? And by being able to communicate that to people, I think we can bring people to a state of humility before God where they say, how can I turn down such an incredibly great offer that Christ has made on my behalf? So hopefully this is something you can share. I encourage you, hey, make your own cutouts of Mr. and Mrs. Flat and use this as a way to help communicate the gospel to people, and hopefully you'll see many people come to faith in Christ. Thank you.